Hey guys, it's Dak and Clair here today. We're doing a little bit of a different video. Today we're going to be testing a bunch of different games between Linux and Windows 11. The PC build I'm using is Asus G10CE, very modified. It's this computer right here. Not the original case. We have the same motherboard and Intel i5-11400F in the system, but we do have a new cooler, which is the Peerless Assassin cooler. We have replaced the power supply with a Corsair RM650E, 32 gigs RAM of XPG RAM, running at 3200 megahertz, and XFX SWFT 6700 non-XT 10 gig video card, and of course all the case fans, which have also, well, G10C didn't have any case fans except for the one. So totally different build. As you can see, we do have a modded BIOS to allow for the RAM to actually hit the proper XMP, since XMP is locked in the BIOS. But this is going to be our test build. Of course, you can see the LIX here, which is running on a different monitor, but we won't be utilizing that as part of the test. It'll just be kind of there in the background as we start to test Windows versus Linux performance. Linux build is going to be Bazzite. Typically I could do Catchy OS as well, but in this video we're going to stick to Bazzite because it is going to be the most easy for people that aren't very tech savvy to get into to test. In this video we will be testing out Black Desert Online, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, Stellar Blade, Cyberpunk 2077, Clair Obscur Expedition 33, and Oblivion Remastered to see and get a good feel for the performance differences between Windows 11 and Linux or Bazzite. So for the first game, we're going to be testing Cyberpunk 2077 at 1440p, all the settings set to high or ultra, ray tracing reflections on. We're going to go with FSR 3.0, and we are going to do that. We're going to have that set to auto. Since most people are going to be playing the game in 1440p or want to know what 1440p would look like, this is definitely the best way to do this. So we'll get this started here. Now we are going to be monitoring everything here. With auto, we're setting at about 13 frames per second. With the GPU pretty well maxing itself out. Definitely easy to do 1080p on this GPU, but since most people want to do 1440p gaming, this is kind of a good general idea of what you're going to expect on at least the Windows version. If we jump over to 1080p, we're going to be looking at roughly probably about 30 frames per second, which is not too bad. Now, outside here, we are hitting up to about 15 frames per second. It does look, as the graph shows, pretty stable for the most part with the odd small dip. So, does it look amazing? No, but at 1080p, it'll definitely be 30 to 45 frames per second. And this is on Windows, so average 13.59 frames per second with a max of 16.65. Like I said, 1080p is going to look great, but Then again, we are also doing this on Linux. So for this next part, we're doing Expedition 33. We're going to have it in the high preset with XeSS, since there is no FSR. We're going to set that to balanced. And resolution scale, we are locked, but that's fine. And then unlimited, and as you can see, everything else is on high settings. We'll start on a new game here. Okay, so with those settings, we are looking at 60 to 66 frames per second, which is not too shabby. And lows of roughly about 50 to 55 frames per second. Now, we can go with a lower preset if we want. Probably just go with medium, which is more than perfectly fine. And we can, and this way, if we can go ultra quality or ultra plus on XeSS. Let's take a look at how that looks. So that nets us at about 50 frames per second, which is more than playable, but we are seeing the odd dip here and there. So our 1% lows are going to be taking a hit. As you can see in the graph here, there's that lovely little dip. Okay, so this should give us a little bit more of an idea, not necessarily for gameplay, but at least it'll give us a slight idea of how the game runs. We are seeing 46 frames per second for this portion here, and then, but definitely very playable, and that's with the medium graphics preset. We can do anti-aliasing, but ultra quality plus is more than plenty. If we jump up to high, then we take a further dip down to about 40 frames per second, even lows of 30, which is still more than plenty. And once again, yeah, we're seeing like 40 frames per second, the small dips here and there. So it's definitely playable. You can definitely see the 1% lows hitting there, but otherwise it's very playable. All right, on to the next game. All right, on into Oblivion here. For settings, we're gonna have this uncapped frame rate. We're going to go borderless because this game requires all that. We'll set the settings to ultra. It is going to be running in 1440p. We are going to use the software ray tracing. FSR set to balanced, and frame gen is off. Just make sure that we are running at 1440p. Yep, perfect. We're going to apply those changes, click back. So currently in this part, we're running at about 73 frames per second, but that will take a drastic dive once we get outside. So we're still getting an average of 66 frames per second, which is good. Once we get out to the open world, we drop down to about 40 frames per second, which still isn't absolutely horrible. Actually, we're seeing 30 frames per second, but very, very playable, and that's at 1440p. 1440p borderless ultra settings on the 6700. So not bad at all. And of course, that's FSR balanced. All right, on to the last game, which is Black Desert Online. This game, of course, plays really, really well, so I'm not too concerned about that, but it gives you a good idea of a different wide range of games that you can play. Okay, next game is Black Desert Online, which we're running at 1440p in remastered mode, texture quality medium, and all the goodies on here. We can turn off this. If we do that, the game does support FSR 1, but as you can see, it's not really needed. You do get about 60 to 70 frames per second in Windows. So this part of the video is actually going to be a lot slower. Particle is easy, so that's not an issue. You will drop to about 40 frames per second if you are on a fast mount, so we'll utilize my good old friend here. And as you can see, yeah, we're hitting 40 frames per second on the mount, so that goes to show you about that. And the last game, which is going to be Dragon Age Veilguard. Okay, so for Dragon Age Veilguard, of course, we're going borderless, VSync on, 1440p. We're going to use FSR. Let's go FSR quality. And we will target the max of this monitor, which is 165 Hertz. Minimum resolution scale, that's fine for what we're doing. Go over to graphics, we're going to have it set on Ultra, which may be too much. Pretty smoothly for the most part, and around that 35-40 frames per second mark. Of course, change your settings to what looks best. High settings are probably going to be better, a lot better than ultra settings, but the fact that we can do this and get reasonable frame rates is pretty good. So while we get this all booted up. All right. So for here, we have this display set to 1440p, graphics, we're going to set to very high. And we are getting roughly 140 frames per second, which is a little bit better than I had anticipated. They just did a update on the game, so that might be why we're seeing more performance, but we are hitting the 10 gigabyte of VRAM usage. Everything is staying cool between 50 and 60 degrees Celsius, with more RAM being used up for this, but we are seeing frames as high as 142 frames per second and lows of about 120. So not too shabby. We're going to run back to the main city area here. So it definitely looks like their last patch definitely gave a massive increase in performance. But we are going to test one other thing here just to make sure. So FSR is set to quality. As you can see, everything is on high or very high settings. And we are still performing way above what we probably should be. The last time that we were in the game before this last update, which just came out about a day ago, we were getting about 85 to 75 frames per second, but the game is now further optimized and we're getting a steady 120, 130 frames per second, which is really, really good to see. Okay, so the first part of the test, I believe we had quality on. We had just a ray tracing on with reflections. So we'll give that a shot first, see how it runs. Have 1440p. Just to show you guys, same settings, 1440p. VSync set to 165 hertz, which is the same as the monitor. So let's give this a shot. I believe we were getting about 15 frames per second, and when we went on to auto, we were hitting about 22 frames per second, so not really all that playable, but I guess we'll find out here in a second how this runs. As we can see here, average 35, min 30, max 44, so very, very playable for this. But we'll take a look at a couple other settings that I believe are not identical. So just over the top, we're going to be running ray tracing. This time we're going to have the reflections, sun shadow, local shadows, and ray trace lighting on medium. We are going to run FSR 3.1 or 3.0 on auto, kind of get a better understanding to see if we're going to get the same frames per second. So 26 frames per second. Like, this is better than what we ever got in Windows for anything here. And this is just in the bar area. Typically you're getting a lot less frames, and then once you head outside, then your frames pick up, but we'll find out here in the next second. Yeah, about 30 frames per second. So you can definitely do medium ray tracing on this card at this level. Throw frame gen on and you're probably going to jump from that 30 frames per second up to 45, 50. So very, very playable with ray tracing, which this card is not very strong on. All right, let's move on over to the next game. All right, so next game up on the list for Linux is Clair Obscur Expedition 33. We currently have the settings here set to the same high setting preset, XeSS, Ultra Quality Plus. And of course, everything is high, as you can see, so looks absolutely gorgeous. And then we'll get this HUD up here to make that work. So okay. So this same part of the game that we did earlier, and we'll do the next part as well. We're seeing about 40 frames per second, average of, and that's on our 1% lows. So an average of 88 frames per second. Now this is most likely going to drop down as it did the last time, but we are seeing way less stutters. So our average is, of course, always going to go down. But yeah, we're hitting, so if you look at the VKD3D there, that's our 45 frames per second, which is comparable to Windows, I'd say. But what we are seeing is that our 1% lows and our 0.1% lows are not taking that hit, and we're not seeing that stutter that we saw on these settings on Windows. So it's playing a lot smoother. And yeah, we'll quickly skip on over to the next part of the game, and then we'll see how that part runs. Okay, so we're over in this part again here. And yeah, we're still getting that 42, 40 frames per second. Our 1% lows are just so much smoother in this area. So you're not always going to see massive gains in your regular frames per second. It's what your gains are going to hit, or where you're going to feel it the most, is in your 1% lows. And this is a prime example of a game where we're seeing a 36 frames per second 1% lows, and we're not getting any stutters, whereas in Windows that's what we're getting. So you're not always going to have a massive difference in your average or your regular frames per second, but your 1% lows are definitely going to play a huge part in how the game feels. So yes, it's playable in Windows, but this is just even further playable. All right, now let's move on to the next game. We'll save the best for last, because I was kind of surprised by the performance on the last game. So we're going to switch on over to Dragon Age Veilguard, and we'll see how that goes. So this one, we're still doing Dragon Age Veilguard, all the same settings. So that Ultra preset display is sitting at 165 Hertz, 1440p. Nothing has changed. FSR set to quality. But let's take a quick look and see what type of what we can get. So I figured this would probably be our best bet. Just start right here. Of course, we're seeing about 60 frames per second. So last time, or on PC, we're running the same settings for, whoops, about 40 frames per second. It said that was pretty playable. Here we're seeing about 60, so fairly decent jump in performance on this game. Average 1% lows of 51 frames per second, which is really, really good. We're still in that high action area. So very good uplift in performance on Linux over Windows here that we're seeing. This should at least, there we go. Yeah, very, very good frames per second uplift here. Way more playable here than what we're seeing on Windows. All right, so on to the next game. We'll go to Black Desert Online here, and then we'll save the very last game for, well, of course, last. Okay, so here's Black Desert Online. Give us a same thing here. See, the frame rates are about the same as Windows. I see no difference, even as far as like you're still hitting those 40 marks when you're on the mount. And we're still seeing the tops at roughly 60 to 70 frames per second. So performance wise for Linux for this game is very, very similar. Not much else I can say, but this is probably the shortest part of the video. So there you have it. Game runs. You do have to launch it through, if you're not using the Steam version, you have to launch it through a program called Lutris. Which is super, super easy because it comes pre-installed on Bazite. So that makes your life a little bit easier if this type of game that you're playing. But all right, on to the very final game. Okay, so for Stellar Blade, we are seeing about 100 frames per second. It's kind of all over the place. I know that in Windows there, we were seeing about 110, 120 frames per second. Keep in mind, this is 1440p, vertical sync on, like all this exact same settings that we had before. But in that game, we were seeing the 120 frames per second. I am going to check something because I may have messed up how the game was running. So may have been cheating on Windows. Oh. So little fun fact, on the Windows version, we had FrameGen turned on, which I didn't realize when I was recording the first portion. So yeah, you would get about 75, 85 frames per second on that. Like here, we're seeing pretty much the same thing. Not sure why it suddenly dropped, but we'll get that in a second. Anyways. So, like we're seeing about 100 frames per second on Linux here, and we do see the drops down to 72, 71 frames per second, 85, right where it should be. So if we go based off of what we had done on Windows, since we want to make this as fair as possible, and we turn FrameGen on, yeah, we suddenly see 106, like we're hitting 160 frames per second. So at that point, yeah, you're running from 110, 120 frames per second up to 150 or 160 frames per second. And that's just on the difference between Linux and here. Now, anything over 60 frames per second, it is okay. Like you can definitely get away with FrameGen because it doesn't pull away from the game. Anything over that, then you want to kind of avoid. But we are seeing some pretty big gains, at least in this game, with FrameGen and without, since we didn't test without FrameGen in the Windows version. So 164 frames per second versus 120, 125 frames per second tops with FrameGen in Windows versus Linux. So really big jump. And our 1% lows are 118 frames per second. Our 0.1% are 78 frames per second. So that just goes to show you that like Linux has come a long way. Yeah, there's games that you can't play, but overall performance is night and day difference when you're looking at the two. So anyways, have yourselves a great one, and we'll see you guys in the next video.